All right, good morning again. Good morning, Miss Klein's seventh grade Bible class. It's good to see you guys together. We're going to continue our study in the book of Leviticus. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there. Leviticus 11. Today, this is my third lesson today with you. It's called Making Sense of Strange Laws. We're going to continue to work inward as we talk about this book in Leviticus. Such a great book. I hope it's been blessing you. And so today, let's jump right in. So let me just say this. Do you realize that there are still some very, very strange laws in our land? For example, in Hawaii, coins are not allowed to be placed in one's ear. Did you know that? In Iowa, kisses may last for no more than 5 minutes. Strange law. In Maine, you may not step out of an airplane in flight. How about from Maryland? It is illegal to take a lion to the movies. How about in Oklahoma? It is illegal to wear your boots to bed. Now, not to be outdone in our great state of North Carolina, here it is. Here's one of our weird laws. Do you realize it is a felony to steal more than $1,000 of grease? Ugh. All right, so we look at these and laugh. So why do we laugh? Because nobody follows these. They're outdated. We consider them not useful for a modern society. So let me ask, is that the way that we view Leviticus? There's all kinds of laws, right? Is it just outdated because of the day? Well, some do. Some believe they're wrong, but some do think this. And so let me just ask, let's just get real nitpicky for a moment. What if I were to say something like this? Now, I have asked each of you, because you're a believer in Jesus, you got to stop eating pork barbecue. Sorry, done. No more trips to Hannah's barbecue. I've done my spade work, so I've looked at this in the Bible. No more barbecue. For that matter, no more Red Lobster. You can't eat shrimp. Say goodbye to those cheese biscuits, people. Now, what if I were to say that to you? Oh, it'd be horrible. I would never say that to you. And we need to know as believers why not. The short answer for that is Acts chapter 10. Peter here gives us this synopsis here of the answer for the question. He didn't eat unclean things, and suddenly he was told by God he could. Now, the idea that unclean food is okay. Side, more than just food, though, God is trying to make a point here in Acts 10 about Gentiles being invited into the family of God. So it's a little bit more to it than that. It was a symbol to this. Now, is that satisfying to some people, that answer? Well, for many, no, that's not. It just brings more questions than answers. For example, why is Leviticus here in the first place? Do you see how this fits together? Why suddenly reverse it? Even more, if these Levitical laws can be thrown out, right, about the shrimp and about the pork, then why not the other rules? How about the ones surrounding our sexuality? How about these, right? They tend to say things like, you Christians decry, and I realize I'm going kind of deep here. They would say things like, you Christians decry homosexuality from Leviticus, but you don't decry God forbidding wearing fabric of two different kinds. You're just cherry picking what you choose to believe. How do you answer that? Well, do you remember when I said earlier that Leviticus is incredibly relevant because it's seen as largely irrelevant? I said that because of today, primarily because of today. So today we're going to look at how to deal with these strange laws. As a matter of fact, this is probably the most important talk in Leviticus. Now, how do we do this? Number one, we got to use our brains, right? We got to use our noggins. It's there for a reason. The other is this. We must be honest about our cultural paradigm, where we are. We must see how really different they were in their generation to our generation. And finally is this. We must see Jesus as the point of it all. So just kind of get that as your grid today as we face this and as we look at this final chapter. So let me just recap if I can. We looked at the symmetry of the book. It's called a chiastic structure that we looked at chapters 1 through 7 and 23 through 27 going together about the rituals there. And then 8 through 10 and 21 through 20 is about the priest. Well, today is about the idea of the purity laws, the ritual, the moral purity. And so we look at those. The first week we looked at the outer rim. We looked at the 5 offerings and the feasts there. The offerings is in chapters 1 through 7. Those were ways to say thank you to God and ways to say I'm sorry to God. The feast were in chapters 23 and following. They were ways to just celebrate who God is and who they were, that God was to be the very object of their celebrations. Last lesson, in lesson 2, we looked at the role of the priests. Their job was to mediate between sinful man and a holy God, but they were far from perfect. Their failure actually points to Jesus, as the book of Hebrews points out. So today we're going to continue moving inward as we focus on the last talk, the Day of Atonement. But we're going to look at these laws for Israel and what did they mean? How do we make sense of them today? So let me get a flare for some of these. Look at Leviticus 11. This is verse 1 through 7. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, These are the living things that you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever parts of the hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud, among the animals you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat. The camel, the rock badger, he goes on to list these. So, all right, get that. Now, Leviticus 13, let's turn to that, beginning at verse 40, says this, If a man's hair falls out from his head, he is bald, he is clean. And if a man's hair falls out his forehead, he has baldness of the forehead, he is clean. That's kind of funny, isn't it? But if there is on the bald head or the bald forehead a reddish-white diseased area, it is leprous disease breaking out on his bald head or his bald head. Then the priest shall examine him, etc., etc. Isn't that interesting? All right, let's look at chapter 18, verse 22. And I recognize I'm going very maybe uncomfortable here. It says, You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. All right, we see that. How do we make sense of that one? Leviticus 19, 17 through 18. It says, You shall not hate your brother in heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take revenge or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And then finally, let's look at 18. Let's go back to 18, verses 1 through 5. It says, And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived. And you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, of which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules, and you shall keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. That's really the point there. 18 is a very, very big passage. So I want you just to get a feel for that as we look at a couple of those passages. All right, let's unpack what we're to look at today. How are we to make sense of this portion, this third lesson here of Leviticus? Now, the first part here is we make sense of these strange laws. Number one, getting a grid. We need to get a grid. So to fully understand these, I kind of need to nerd out for a moment. I want to give you a horizontal and then a vertical grid to sort of place this book on of Leviticus. Theologians have really helped us make sense of Leviticus, and they talk about the Mosaic law being categorized in one of three ways. And so let's first look at this vertical grid. I'm going to call this, or well, not me, this is what it's called, the moral aspect of the law, the moral. Now these are laws that are universal in application. For example, the Ten Commandments, and places here in Leviticus that expand on that, like don't murder, don't steal, right? These laws are written across the fabric of every human culture, if not 99.9%. They're written there. They're still in effect today, right? Do not murder. That's still in play for today. The consequences are not. The consequences are different for many of these, and we're going to look at that more in a moment. But this is the aspect of the moral law, that those are still in play for today. So that's the first one. The second aspect of the law is the civil law, the civil laws. These are laws applicable to Israel in this particular era. Now they were in the wilderness, and they're coming out of 400 years of slavery, and God had to deprogram them, and He didn't want them to be like the nations around them. We just read that in chapter 18. Here's an example. We didn't read this, but it says, don't cut your hair along the sides. What? Strange, isn't it? Here's the simple answer. God didn't want them to look like the Canaanites. Makes sense. Now, let me just take this one for a minute. The spirit of this civil law lives on. But the Lord still doesn't want us looking like the world. Like a good dad doesn't want his daughters looking like a pop star today, right? We don't want that. But we don't follow these today. We do have a modern day example. What you wear, like in your school, right? You have to wear khaki pants and a golf shirt, or if you're a girl, a skirt, right? You have to wear those every day. But for me, I could come into your classroom. I'm not under that law. I don't have to wear khaki pants and a matching shirt. I don't have to do that. But here's the spirit. I can't just wear whatever, right? I can't just wear whatever I can, right? That's still in play. So that's the idea of the spirit of the law being in play. Now, let me take this a step further. Not only of the attire, but what about this? Can you pull a fire extinguisher? Can you pull that as a student? You can't do that. You get a fine, plus you'll get in trouble with your administration. What about me? I can't do that either. So that's an example of the moral law. It's still in play for today. I hope you understand that. So see that, the idea of the moral law, the civil law, but there's another aspect of the law that we need to catch. Is the ceremonial law. These were laws that surrounded the ceremonial worship of God. That the priests were given very specific instructions on how to approach God, and these are a little clearer to see why we don't do this, because Jesus is the true sacrifice, of which all of these sacrifices were but a shadow. Remember when he said, "It is finished," and the temple curtain was torn in two, and that's the reason why we don't follow these. That these were to echo Jesus's work, and so it's odd too. I'll throw this in there, that Jews today don't even follow these. They have a very strange reason why, and we'll look at that more in a moment. But I want you to see this, that there's three aspects of the law: the moral law, universal today; civil law, only for Israel in this era; and the ceremonial law, things that were put in place in this era but points to the work of Christ. And that's why we don't follow these. So just see this: the moral law still in play for today. The civil and ceremonial are not, really are not. We are in a different era. And so here's the big question. How do we tell the difference? How do we tell the difference? Answer. We got to use our brains. All right, so here's an example. What about you shall not steal? Is that moral, civil, or ceremonial? Good, I heard you. Moral. Excellent. What about you shall not wear two different kinds of fabrics? What about that one? Is that moral, civil, or ceremonial? All right, good. Civil. That's the idea. So I want you to see this sort of vertical part here of how these laws are gridded. Now, I want to give you this horizontal aspect because I do want you to understand where we are in the timeline. Now, we must understand their culture. See why I'm going with horizontal? Understand this? We must step outside our sort of cultural grid for a moment and see things from a more diverse perspective. See, here's an example. When they thought of slavery, they didn't think the same way we did. For example, in Exodus 21, it says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, we're shocked when we read that. Well, don't be. It's more like an indentured servant. If you actually keep reading, you see an awful lot of protection for her. In fact, these laws prohibited slavery. So the point I'm making is so much of the world does not see the world like we do in America, and this year is 2020. Most of us just don't see the world like this. We need to step outside of our cultural grid. And the other is this: we must be honest about our cultural place. See, our culture, no offense, but we don't know how to think. We just don't. Our world is like microwaves. We want quick, easy answers. We see the word or hear the word slave, and our minds immediately go to the barbarism of the 1800s and before and whatnot. If the answer involves any kind of thought or sequence or sequential sort of thinking, it tends to get lost. And so before reading Leviticus, we really need to take our blinders off. We really need to realize the world and how it's different. We're not better. We're not. We're not worse. We're just very, very different. So get a grid here. The three laws: moral, civil, ceremonial. I hope that's sort of the vertical part. And then a grid for our culture, that we do live in a very different culture. We need to understand these. We must put on our sandals, so to speak, and see these from a different perspective. Now, let's dive in. Number one was getting a grid. Number two, let's answer some of these very difficult questions. All right, I want to look at a few. We need to look at them. You almost need to do it case by case, one at a time. There are difficult laws, but there are also really great laws. I want you to see the understandable parts of Leviticus. It really has, if we can just be really nerd out for a moment, it has impacted much of our Western society, and I would argue Eastern society, the whole world. Most cultures have various laws that prohibit murder, prohibit stealing. Leviticus was no different, but I want to make this case that Leviticus goes much, much further than any other thing, most further than any culture ever did. In other words, these chapters did something virtually no other culture did. Here's a few. They ended slavery, something new to this world. They protected women, something new to this world. They protected the poor and the disabled. They protected the elderly. They protected the foreigner and the immigrant. These are things that were very new to the world. See, the world around them, Egypt and the Canaanites, had little to no concern for women, the poor, the fatherless, the foreigner. Israel's laws actually go counter-culture. Now, let's read some of these. Here's Leviticus 18. I read this before. It bears worth mentioning again. Let me read this again from Leviticus 18. Let me just turn with it here. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt." Hear that. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt. God says, don't do that. Find life. Take a different route. So see that really as our real foundational part before we dive in. He wants them to come out and be separate, be different. Now, let's look at some of these good laws, because I want to catch this, because there were laws that kept the community safe. This is especially poignant as we think about where we are. Currently, it's April 2nd, 2020. We are under a quarantine with this COVID virus. Now, it's very interesting. Look at Leviticus 13. Turn with me there. Verses 45. Let's see if I can find it here. It says, "The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and shall cover his upper lip, and cry out, Unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as he is in the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside of the camp." Isn't that interesting? Here we are, the quarantine rules, right? They have a bigger purpose. They were meant to keep the community safe. They wanted to separate the sick and the healthy, right? Now see that. We're doing that right now. However, there is a path back to the community. They were not meant to be left out forever. Here it is in Leviticus 14, verse 3. It says, "And the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then if the case of the leprous is healed, and the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take him in." You see that? Isn't that interesting? "He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp and bring him in." The priest goes to the sick man. He doesn't leave him there to rot. Now, does this ring a bell? Jesus did this. The Pharisees forgot this, right? The priest went out and met him. This is what Jesus is doing. See, in Jesus' day, lepers, they were always unclean. They didn't have a time when they were considered clean, right? Always. The point I'm making is this. This was for the community's good. It was. But there was a path back. We need to see that. That's a good law. It makes sense, doesn't it? Now, here's another. How about mildew laws? Kind of weird, isn't it? Anybody struggling with mildews today? That's in Leviticus 14. I'm not going to read that today, but take that if you want. Leviticus 14, verse 38. I don't know. We don't think it's a big deal today. Mildew. I mean, you just go shh, shh, and it's gone, or you call CERTA or whatever. But this could be deadly back then. If mildew or mold comes into a house, it's a big deal today. Don't get me wrong. But it was an even bigger deal in those days. They were to exit the house for a week. And if the mildew remained, they were to scrape it, take out the diseased parts, and if it persists, to tear it down. In fact, mildew could have destroyed the entire village. Do you see the simple point? God wanted his people safe. He wanted them healthy, right? It's true today. It's an interesting passage in 1 Timothy 4. It says, physical health has some value. Now, there's a deeper echo to this, but these clean and unclean laws are really about God's holiness. See, Leviticus begins to show us that God is the God of life. Even in Eden, there was nothing of death there. And because of the fall, broken and unclean things are here. And unclean didn't necessarily mean in sin, right? You could be unclean by touching mold, touching a dead person, all these things you had to do, giving birth. But all of these things were concerning pain and death and the fall. These were to be a reminder that one day we won't have the pains of this life, the brokenness of this life. But until then, God provided a way. So see that. See all these laws that were really good things for the protection. Now, let me pivot. Because Leviticus 18 and 19, we're shot. That's the big one, right? And again, I hope it's okay for me to talk about some of these things. I realize it's very, very deep, but let me back up for a moment, because there really were laws that protected women, right? I'm going to blow your mind. See, in most cultures, there was really no protection for women. They were no big deal. Now, God is going to say otherwise in a series of ways to protect women. Here's the first one, Leviticus 19:29. I'm going to try and keep this as PG as possible, but this is a prohibition, right, against women being used as an intimate tool. Let me just say it like that. See, nearly every culture I studied on this has a history of this. I mean, that men would use women in very perverted, awful ways. The gist is this, that they would turn women as a sort of a temple goddess for their pleasure. The sad part is this is seen everywhere, from Egypt to Canaan, even in Japan, South America. It's all the same thread. It's horrible, horrible things. Sorry, let me turn off my cell phone here. Here's something from Herodias in the 5th century. He writes this: the foulest Babylonian custom is that which compels every woman of the land to sit in the temple of Aphrodite and have relations with some stranger. Oh, wow. I mean, nearly every cult has this angle. Here's the point. God says, don't do this. Trafficking is wrong. This is where this comes from. It doesn't value the imago Dei, the image of God that women deserve. So I think you can thank Leviticus for our Western minds, for our Western morality really gravitating towards this. Thank the Lord, it does protect women, but it also protects women even more. There's an interesting thing, a prohibition not to expose women. And I'm not going to read Leviticus 18 verse 6, but you're going to read this phrase, uncover the nakedness. It's used much here. It implies vulnerability, being exposed when weak. See, in the ancient world, women were cattle. But here God says not to violate women like this, right? It says this about men twice. Here, older men. Talks about women 19 times, though. I want you to see this. Israel was to treat women with respect. I teach this to my son. Treat women with utmost respect. Be a gentleman. You can thank Leviticus for treating women with dignity. I want you to see this. It was absolutely groundbreaking the way that they protected women. Now, there's a third thread that I want you to see. Laws that protected children. This is from Leviticus 20. And this is very, very sad. It says, say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel or the strangers who sojourn in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech shall surely be put to death. Now, it's a horrible chapter, but let me explain what's going on. You read the word Molech, right? See, in those days, if there was no rain, no food, they would sacrifice to this Canaanite god named Molech. He was horrible. I won't tell you how awful this was. It involved fire and screaming. And they would think that the purer the sacrifice, the better the odds of finding rain or sending rain, that the gods, that Molech would send rain. That's why they did this. And listen, it was not just seen in Canaan. I read this week that Aztecs, they also believed that the innocent tears of a child would send rain. In Japan, legends talk about how kids were, I don't even want to read this to you. They would do these things to children with this twisted belief that some false god would send rain. Do you see how Leviticus protects children in a way that no other culture did? See, this is the root of it when Jesus would say, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for such as them is the kingdom of the Lord." The Lord, Molech, this god Molech, I think, it's my hunch, but I think God hated him the most. See, Israel was not to treat children as disposable things, but things that also, regardless of age, regardless of placement even in the womb, might I add, Israel was not to treat children like this. They bear the image of God right from conception. This is why I am pro-life, and I pray that you are too. So I want you to see this, as these are all of these laws that Israel was to put in, which is good for society, good for them. There are other laws. Here's a couple. Leviticus 19, verse 9, caring for the poor. Leviticus 19:14, caring for the blind and the deaf. Leviticus 19:15, not showing partiality. Leviticus 19:32, respecting the elderly. 19:33, caring for the outsider. 19 verse 35 to 36, being honest. You see all of these really good laws that make a lot of sense. The big point, God is commanding Israel to go counterculture. And I think we thank much of our Western morality to Leviticus. It has much gold there. Now, those are the easy ones. What happens when we get to laws that are more tricky? All right. There's several. And listen, people have been working on these for 2,000 years, okay? It's nothing new. So when you see, like I always tell my college kids, when you hear in college, Dr. Smarty Pants comes up and say, well, because Leviticus says this, then blah, right? There is an answer. Now, for sake of time, I realize we could take hours to do this. I only want to look at two of these. Realize again, nothing's new. We could answer these. Now, here's a first difficult question I want to ask from Leviticus, and it's this. Can Christians still eat shrimp? Can Christians still eat pork? Can we do that? Let me just catch this with you. This is from Leviticus 11, sorry. Leviticus 11, verse 4. It says, nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, okay, that's no big deal. And the rock badger, all right. You had any rock badger lately? Not me. And verse 6, and the hare or the rabbit, right? Okay, well, I haven't had rabbit, but I can live without it. And then verse 7, and the pig. Oh no, I had bacon. We had sausage last night. Are we in trouble? How about Leviticus Leviticus verses 9. It says, everything in the waters that have fins and scales or seas in the river you may eat, but anything in the river that does not have fins and scales you shall not eat. You shall regard them as detestable. I love me some shrimp. Oh no, right? How do we do with this? Now, there's been a lot of theologians who've had great answers, and let me just kind of crystallize this. It's a lot to it, but it's crystallized really around two angles, and it's this. Number one is our health. Number one is our health. Many make that argument, which I will buy. I think it's got some merit to this, that the unclean animals were bottom feeders, some of them. Others ate on dead things that were to be disposed of, and there would be a greater chance that they would get a parasite from these things. And that makes a lot of sense, is it to you? That God wanted them healthy for the journey, that God wants us healthy. But the second reason is much, much more important. It was to be a daily reminder for Israel to leave death and follow life. That the Lord would institute a sermon along the way, right? Just as animals fed off dead things, Israel was not to feed off dead things. Do you see that? She was to fill her mind with good things. Paul would say this in Philippians 4:8. I want you to read that. Point is that God wants to be a teacher to them, not just on Sabbath, but he wanted the rhythms of their life to be a reminder of the goodness of the Lord. It's no different for us. We are too to leave sin daily. We are to be in the Word and not feed off the things that give death, right? We're to be in the Word much more than Sundays. Now, biblically, we do have grounds to eat pork and shrimp in the opener in Acts 10. Let me just kind of expound on that a little bit more. Peter sees a bunch of unclean animals, and God says, get up and eat. And Peter says, no, I couldn't. And, well, there's a lot going on. There's a Gentile named Cornelius who's part of the story. The point is this, just as pork is clean, so are Gentiles. Therefore, we can go eat barbecue. We can do that because of Jesus. That's the answer. We don't show our devotion to God by not eating shrimp. We show our devotion to God through Christ who gave his life for us. I want you to see that, understand that. Yes, it's okay to do that today. Now, second difficult question. All right, turn to Leviticus 19:19. Turn with me there. Leviticus 19:19. All right. It says, Leviticus 19, I'll just start at the different verse, the second part. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seeds. You shall not wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material. Here's the question. Can Christians wear polyester? You ever thought about that? It seems crazy to us, but it's a great question. You just read the prohibition here. Here, God seems to say that Israel cannot wear two different kinds of clothing. So, am I not allowed to go to Belk's? Why not? All right, the answer is, of course, I can wear polyester, but here's the reason. There's lots of reasons, by the way, but here's really the ones that are the most acclaimed, the ones that are most easy to understand. It's this. It's to again remind them that they were to be separate from the world, that they were to be separate from the Canaanites. And this was their lesson. This was the thing that God posited in their world to remind them daily to come out and to be separate. We have this too, right? In Corinthians it speaks of not marrying an unbeliever, not being unequally yoked, that they also were to not mix things like cattle even. See, the Canaanites mixed their cattle with other animals in an odd sort of fertility worship, and that's the reason. And God says, don't look like them. Don't look like the world. Now, there's also another reason that is very good, and it's the priests. It's the priests. See, in those days, there was a group who was to wear clothing of two different kinds. It's the priests. Do you realize this? They were to do that. They were to set apart and offer sacrifices to God. That Israel didn't like the priest's authority over them. And so when the Lord says to the everyday Israelite, don't look like a priest, right? Here's the reason. God may have said that to protect them from going down this road of rebellion. Here's another way to think about this. It's like telling a young kid, a young teenager or adult, to not wear a police uniform. That's the idea. That God wanted them to be reminded of who they were and submit to his ways. Now, that's the idea. So kind of see that. Yeah, it's okay. We're in a different era. That was one of these civil laws. Now, let me say the hardest one for last. And again, I realize this is a deep one. This is a tough one. This is so counterculture today. It is the issue of our culture. And it's the third and final one. It's this. Should Christians fight to make homosexuality a capital offense? Now, let me read this. This is from Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18, verse 22. And it says, you shall not lie with the male as with the woman. It is an abomination. And then finally in verse 20, verse 13, and it says, if a man lies with the male as with a woman, they shall surely be put to death. Wow, right? So do we just throw that out too? See, homosexuality, along with other sins, by the way, I don't want to just pick on that one. There are other sins. But here it carries with it the capital punishment. So should Christians fight to implement this? Christians have historically never done this. Never. We've never done this. But you wonder why. Well, obviously, we're in a different era. We're in a different period. Christians for millennia have accepted the mandate, have understood that this is against the ways of the Lord, but have rejected the punishment. Do you know why? Short answer, Jesus. Jesus. But why? Now, let me give you an analogy. Suppose you're reading a handbook for the military. Chapter 1, it's about how to relate to each other during basic training and peace times. But chapter 2 is how to relate to each other if you're captured behind the enemy lines. Now, suppose a soldier is captured, right? Which would he obey, chapter 1 or chapter 2? Of course, chapter 2. No one would blame the soldier if he obeys chapter 2 and not chapter 1. That's the idea. We're in a different period. See, Christians have always understood this to be a time when God's laws govern the nation of Israel. But now, God has given the power of the state over to the other nations. He's done this. So the way He governed them en route to the promised land is not the same as today. Let me say it another way. I may spank my child when they're 3, but I'm not going to spank them when they're 13. I'm going to take away their cell phone, which is far worse, isn't it? Right? The idea is that we're in a different era. And so, here's the hard question. Does that mean that homosexuality is okay? In other words, if I throw out the punishment, is it okay to throw out the mandate? This is where we must use Scripture to interpret Scripture. Now, Paul, look with me in Romans 1, verse 26. Paul had a view on homosexuality. He says, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up their natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving themselves the due penalty for their error. It's very similar again in 1 Corinthians 5. The point I'm making is in both cases, Paul is clearly condemning a violation to this sense, this gift that God's given us. But notice what is not prescribed: the death penalty. Isn't that interesting? Keep reading. In Romans 1, in 1 Corinthians 5, the law is still in play, the prohibition is still in play, but not the capital punishment. You ever wonder that? Why? Why? The answer is the war is over. Jesus paid the penalty that is due the perversion of this sin. And may I say, many others? That's why Christians don't affix the capital punishment to this. Paul, in other words, let me just say it. Paul said, yes, it's a sin, but no, we don't treat it like yesteryear. It's a different era. The point is this: the war is over. The penalty has been paid. We are in a new covenant. So see this. And let me just say this too, that you realize that all sin deserves this. Not just, let's don't pick on homosexuality. See, this only makes sense when we tie in Jesus. Now, please keep hearing me, because I want to go to the gospel application. I want to do that. That's the third point I want to draw for today. See, I realize that many might not like that explanation of why we don't execute violators. I get that. I understand that. It's still rubbing you the wrong way. So, can I tie in the gospel? I want to shine light on Jesus for a moment. And let me ask, what does the gospel have to do with Leviticus? Well, for one, Leviticus outlines the way life used to be and will be again. Interesting quote by Nancy Guthrie. Let me read this to you. It says, let's face it, the laws about what things make a person ceremonial clean or unclean found in Leviticus 11 through 15 are strange. Yet when we study them, we see that everything that makes a person unclean is something that reflects the effects of the curse of sin on this world. Animals feed on other animals only after the curse. Bodies bled and developed disease only after the curse. Mold and mildew, the visible evidence of decay, came into being only after the curse. Everything designated unclean in Leviticus demonstrates that things are not the way they once were in the garden, the way God originally intended them to be. The laws regarding what is clean and unclean in Leviticus give us hope that we who are unclean may be made clean through an acceptable sacrifice, and will one day be made holy to enter into the presence of God. What a beautiful quote. See, the thing is that the gospel is the message that one day shall return to this place, right? We shall return. That's the gospel. One day we will return. That death, while here, will not have reign over there. That unclean things can be made clean by another. That the new heavens and the new earth will be a place of life, not death. So, I'm still left with this question. Why so harsh? Why for such a violation? God could have done this without being so harsh. Let me ask it this way: do homosexuals let me just leave it. Do homosexuals deserve eternal death? Yes, they're sinners. Now, do other non-marital acts deserve eternal death? Yes. What about Sabbath breakers? Yes. What about people who curse their parents? Yes. What about kidnappers? Yes. What about people who pick up sticks on Sabbath? Yes. You see where we're going? We all deserve death. We all deserve it. Let's don't just pick on one group. In fact, you deserve death for the slightest violation of the law. James 2 verse 10 says this, "For whoever keeps the whole law, but fails in one point, has become accountable for all of it." And then look at Romans 6:23, "For the wages of sin is death." Friends, this is the big point you got to see. Leviticus shows us that these punishments were carried by another. Do you see how we need to see Jesus in this? That he took the punishment for you. Now listen, you don't remain in your sin. You will face this same God. But let him pay it for you and go and sin no more. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And then Romans 10:4, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes." So let me just ask, why do we not practice these anymore? This means that he took your shame, your sin, your guilt, and nailed it to the cross, of which we will celebrate at Easter. So he became sin for the homosexuals. He became sin for the heterosexuals who violate this. He became sin for the Sabbath breakers. He became sin for the vilest offenders. Can I just say this? The point of this whole talk is just, God, you are great. See, these laws show us the greatness of what Jesus did for me. So today, be sober. Yeah, run from those violations. Obey the moral laws. Catch the spirit of the civil laws. But let them drive you to the ceremonial laws of what they shadow, the perfect sacrifice, who bled and died for Adam's helpless race. So, Mrs. Klein's 7th grade Bible class today boldly approached the throne because of Christ. I pray that for you today. So there you go. That's the next part in Leviticus session 3, Making Sense of Strange Laws. I hope you were blessed today. Hope you guys are doing great. Lord bless, Lord bless, Lord bless. Have a great day.